Thank you, Snezhana, for such a kind introduction, and thank you, Mark, and the Academy for Cultural Diplomacy for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here amidst such prominent speakers and participants, and I am deeply honored to speak after Caitlin and before President Constantinescu. And I have a very tough task because it's right after lunch. It's after a very engaging session, and so I have to think how to keep your attention and interest. I will start by one of the moments that made me proud when I was Prime Minister. I think what I'm most thankful for is that the reputation of Moldova has changed in the last several years and has changed quite impressively. So if Moldova appeared in international news, it was because of some corruption scandal. So 10 years ago, for example, we had a big banking fraud, or it was about the Transnistrian region where we had Russian troops. But lately, we appeared in the news with much more positive aspects. So Moldova was the country that received the most number of Ukrainian refugees per capita in Europe. We dealt with two very big energy crises in a way that was equitable and provided people with support. We have also become candidate members of the European Union. And we have actually, I will argue here, begun using much more aptly our culture, our heritage, to promote our country. So in December 2022, one of the moments that made me proud was that for the first time, I think, Moldova entered the UNESCO Intangible Heritage List. We, together with Romania, so yesterday we heard from Irina about the importance of cooperation when countries share some of the same sort of folklore and traditions. So together with Romania, we submitted the case for the traditional blouse with embroidery on the shoulders. It's called the shirt with altița, right, with a specific Romanian word for the embroidery. So this was recognized as a UNESCO cultural heritage. And you would think, why would a country under such difficult circumstances in 2022, put resources and put its efforts into a submission to UNESCO Intangible Heritage and, spend government resources on sending people there and, collaborating and putting a focus on it. And I will not tell you that culture was my main preoccupation. And I will be honest with you, for me, there were other things that were important. But I knew that protecting investment in culture and promoting our cultural heritage and our culture and cooperating with other countries on culture was particularly important during the times of crisis and war, because we were asking our people to be resilient. We were asking our people to defend their values, to stand for something. And if we don't have our culture and our cultural heritage, what is our civilizational choice? What are our values that we are standing up for, that we are defending in the face of crisis, in the face of difficulties, and in the face of war? And this was expressed in a number of ways. It was not just our submission to UNESCO. And I want to stop here and give you a little bit of background on Moldova and why it was so affected by the war in Ukraine. So Moldova shares a long border with Ukraine, so 1,200 kilometers of border, and then approximately 1/3 of that border is not controlled by the Moldovan authorities. So it's the Transnistrian region, which is a secessionist region on the territory of which we have Russian troops. So in case you didn't know, right west to Ukraine, there is this territory where we have Russian troops, and they present a threat from the territory of Moldova to Ukraine. When the war started, not only did we have this secessionist region, but we were also 100% dependent on our gas provision from Russia and 100% dependent on our electricity provision from a electricity producing plant in the Transnistrian region, which used Russian gas. And we also were facing a potential humanitarian crisis because the Odessa region, for example, is walking distance to Moldovan border. I have met refugees on our borders who have walked from Odessa. And to give you sort of a sense of how small Moldova is in comparison with Ukraine, we are a population of 2.6 million, and just the Odessa region in Ukraine is 2.5 million. So in fact, and also we were facing an economic crisis because Odessa port was the main logistics hub for Moldova, both for imports and for exports. So even before the war, we faced a blackmail by Gazprom, who decided not to provide gas to Moldova, and we had a very severe crisis which really put a risk on our gas transportation system. But we managed to, for the first time in Moldova's history, to go to the market and buy a certain quantity of gas on the tradable market, and this helped us deal with the crisis. And then within a year, we basically diversified 100% of our gas provision from alternative sources. This came at a huge price for people because tariffs for gas went up 7 times and for electricity 3 times. And an average Moldovan household was spending 45% of their income on gas and electricity bills, in comparison to a European household, which spends, maybe 5%. So imagine if it grows if the amount even doubles for a European family, by far it doesn't have the same impact as it had on Moldovan families. And we had stagflation, so inflation was 35%, and then the economy decreased by 6%. So it was a very difficult economic situation for people when so both before the war and then when the war began in particular. We also received more than 800,000 people for a country of 2.6 million Ukrainian refugees passed through Moldova, and 80,000 approximately stay to this day in Moldova. So, in a sense, we had multiple fires to put out and multiple crises to deal with. But as we were deciding on increasing the budget for defense, we were also deciding to increase the budget for culture. So what we did immediately following the war. So the war started on the 24th of February, and usually in Moldova on the 1st of March, we have a series of concerts and cultural events that celebrate the so-called Merțișor, which is a symbol of spring. And we were faced with a situation. There is a war. It's coming very close to us, and it's going to affect us dramatically. Do we continue these concerts? Is it appropriate? And what we've decided, of course, with sort of consultations and volunteers who immediately sort of started to come to the aid of the government in this crisis situation, we actually completely changed the focus of these concerts. And we called these a series of concerts, Moldova for Peace. And we had the entire focus not only about spring, but about resilience, about hope, about sort of resisting in difficult times and in times of war. And not only this, we hosted a lot of Ukrainians, musicians and artists. You remember how difficult some of the theaters were hit. So for the Mariupol theater, for example, and we offered not only our homes to the Ukrainian refugees, but also our cultural institutions to artists and creators from Ukraine. We also dedicated a budget to new cinema productions. So, we never had a budget for cinema. And now we actually have some very talented cinematographers creating relevant relevant content that is now even in Moldovan cinemas. We never had before 22 Moldovan production in Moldovan cinemas. So, we dedicated some of the resources, and then we had a very transparent sort of international jury judge on the creativity, so that there is trust, and so that there is sort of a good attitude in the society towards this. We also gave more funding to theaters. In Moldova, theaters were always supported by the government only through salaries. And then any sort of staging or creation that they did from their own resources. But we were just coming out of the pandemic, if you remember, right? So the war started in the early 22. It was, nobody had the resources. And yet we were living times where people of culture also needed to express themselves. And the population in general needed some of this culture to be able to process their emotions, to be able to deal with their mental health, to be able to deal with this insecurity that they were feeling. So again, the government dedicated some resources for this. And also, we continued with a program that we proposed even before the war began, and that is to give a cultural voucher to every 18-year-old. So when young people turned 18, and turn 18, because this program is continuing now, they receive 50 euros to spend either for tickets in theater, cinema, for books, or other sort of culturally enriching activities. And I must say, to this day, about 3/4 of the money is actually spent on books. I want to underline again sort of how important it is to sort of, and I'll give here a quote. The former Czech president Václav Havel, he said, "In the dark times, the only light may be cultural heritage, the only refuge valuing traditions that confirm our humanity." So, my Minister of Culture, he would come to me and he would say, I think he attributed this quote to Churchill, I never researched it, but he said, we can't stop funding in culture because people need to know what they're fighting for. So we actually did that, and I don't regret a single moment that this is sort of the decisions that we've made, and this is the trade-offs that we have decided on. And I want to sort of take a broader view a little bit. And, it's not, culture, is not sort of devoid of time and space and context. And it always plays a role. We've heard in numerous lectures the role that it plays in sort of different historical events. And I will argue to you that the war in Ukraine that we see now and what is happening sort of in my region is actually a huge failure of Russia to employ soft power and to use cultural diplomacy to exert influence on the countries that it wants to exert influence on. So what we have seen throughout the years, if you think about countries like Ukraine or Moldova or countries of the former Soviet Union, you had their population who spoke Russian. You still have, in many of these countries, a large proportion of the population that is fluent in Russian, that is very open to Russian culture and to different expressions of Russian culture. So these countries were actually more primed to respond to soft power coming from the East than to soft power coming from the West. But what happened is that Russia consistently chose elements of hard power. So if you look at Moldova's history, the moment that Moldovan politicians would, say or declare things that the Russian government didn't like, we were faced with an embargo of some sort of or another. So, for example, Moldova is a big producer of wine, and most of its wine used to go to Russia and the former Soviet Union because this is where the wine was known. And we had 2 embargoes on our wine, which severely hit our sort of performance in the agricultural sector and in the economy in general. And this was always sort of the type of negotiations that was being used in relations to the governments in these countries. So, in fact, instead of sort of thinking, well, how to interact in a way that respects people, that promotes people-to-people contacts, that increases collaboration, that makes the countries think that they are dignified in their relationship with a much stronger neighbor, Russia chose to consistently employ hard power. And then, of course, this led to the countries seeking refuge or seeking, a more cooperative way of basically developing and having alliances and having cooperation frameworks. And this led to sort of the people choosing more and more the model of liberal democracies where each individual can better realize their potential, that they can enjoy some human rights, they can enjoy more economic freedom and opportunity or a more competitive environment. So this is not something that happened overnight, and this is not something that had to happen. So, when we think about these issues, and, we sometimes think of them as sort of, soft issues or, maybe something that doesn't come to the fore when you're faced with a budgetary constraint, or when, you have to sort of think about, social protection or growth, or some of these issues that governments are sometimes very much concentrated on. We always have to remember that, culture is not sort of something that is there when the times are good and we celebrate. Culture is there as part of us, as part of our lives, as part of our sort of daily existence, as part of what defines us. So even in a time of crisis and war, this is actually the first things that we should pay attention to, so that we can avoid much worse circumstances in the medium and long term. So in interviews that I have given, so even following following my time in office, this, for me, this is a tragedy that, soft power could have been used to live in peace and cooperation and to have actually a much better condition for all the people in my region. But instead, these hard power elements win. So to conclude, I want to congratulate you that you have chosen to actually study and focus on how we can employ cultural diplomacy, and especially here talking about folklore, how we can use some of these elements to basically make a better world for us and our children and grandchildren. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, and we'd welcome your questions and comments for the Honorable Ms. Gavrilita. As always, please raise your hand, and then if you could briefly stand and introduce yourself. Who would like to go first? Yes, please.
When you're talking about books, which line do you have now in the literature that young people mainly are interested in? Because a lot of your cultural heritage comes from Russian literature. And at this situation now in which you are politically trying to distance yourself of Russia, how do you face that? How is the educational system handling this?
This is a great question, actually, and it has been one debated in the Moldovan society throughout the years. So until 1991, Moldova was part of the Soviet Union, and we learned in school the so-called Moldovan writers, and then we had classes on Russian literature, where we learned about Russian or other Soviet writers. Now, interestingly, when the national rebirth movement started in the late 80s, some of us discovered for the first time that actually the Moldovan writers we were studying were actually Romanian writers. We speak Romanian in Moldova, so the indigenous population, or the Moldovans, they actually speak Romanian, and our literature and literary legacy is actually the same as Romanian legacy. So already since the late 80s and early 90s in school, students actually learn about the Romanian literary legacy rather than the Russian one. Of course, I mean, you still have the history where, for example, I grew up in a household, even though my native language is Romanian, and we speak Romanian in my household. I went to a Romanian school, but the majority of our books in the house were Russian and in Russian and of Russian writers. So there is still a big influence, and of course there is extraordinary. I think Dostoevsky is genius, and I think everybody should read The Idiot. But this is now more of a sort of influence of global culture and global writing. So it's studied in universal literature rather than sort of in the courses or in the curricula that is in our schools. So we study, our students study Romanian history and those who wrote in Romanian.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is on the part of refugees. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, in collaboration with the Republic of Moldova government, launched the 2024 Regional Refugee Response Plan, RRP, aiming to assist the refugees and vulnerable Moldavians with the USD 303 million. But in 2024 and 2014, there was a scandal of fraud in Moldova. So I just want to know, this huge amount of money that will be spent in your country in relation to the fraud that happened in 2014, how do you deal with this issue of fraud in your country?
So I could speak about this issue until tomorrow morning because it's a complex issue with a lot of sort of ramifications. But what we had in 2014 was an oligarchic government that captured state institutions and used for their personal gain. It wasn't just corruption, it was actually high-level sort of political capture of institutions by an oligarchic force. And the fraud basically was not, from assistance that was given from outside. The fraud was siphoning money through non-performing loans of the state-owned banks and commercial banks. And then, ultimately this fraud was covered by issuing money from the National Bank of Moldova. So in fact, it was basically stealing from the people of Moldova through by depleting the reserves of the National Bank, and it was done through the banking system. Moldova actually dealt with the refugee problem a lot with its own resources. So when you mentioned the refugee response plan, it actually came later in the refugee crisis. So in the very beginning, one important thing that we did is planning and preparing. So if you remember, the United States government kept telling everybody that, there is a buildup of troops of the Russian Federation, and there is very likely to be, a full-fledged war. I think a lot of us sort of were in denial, and especially like in Moldova, we thought, how can this happen? How can it be, a war, like an aggression war, like, the biggest after Second World War on the European continent of that scale, between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, this is inconceivable. But we still had a number of meetings where we worked out all the algorithms, like what are the risks in different areas? What are our resources? What are we going to do? So we actually had already a prepared response plan to the refugee crisis by the time the war began. A government one. It was secret because we didn't want to panic the population, but we did have it ready. So the Ministry of Internal Affairs already had sort of the locations worked out, what are we going to have to do as part of the National Emergency Committee to simplify the refugee sort of flows. What are we going to do with unaccompanied children, for example, or pets? I mean, we had a lot of the details worked out, and because of this, we were able to very quickly process these refugee flows. We received 5 times more than UNHCR had estimated our capacity to be. So they thought we were capable, through our systems and our size, to receive 25,000 people. At the highest point, we had 125,000 people in Moldova at any one given moment. So, and as I said, over time, almost 1 million passed through Moldova. And we did that because from the very beginning of the war, I think everybody in Moldova sort of coalesced in a way that we haven't seen before. So we had private sector contributing. We had them, support with logistics. We had civil society organizations getting involved. And we had regular people, basically from the day one. We had families who would go to the border and offer housing to refugees. So a lot of the Ukrainian refugees, especially early in the war, stayed with Moldovan families. So I visited an elderly French teacher. She was 80, and she had a small apartment in our capital. And she received sort of 3 generations of women, so the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter. And I asked her, like, what motivates you? I mean, why did you receive these refugees in your home? And she said, I remember that I had to flee with my mother when I was small in the Second World War, when they were bombing the bridges between Moldova and Romania. So because it was so close to home, because we have sort of this memory in our history, everybody stood up and everybody sort of decided to help in any way they can. So we had a brief moment where we were truly united in trying to sort of support the refugees and at the same time being worried about will the war reach our borders or not. And we spent government resources. Yes, we also created a working group, a coordination group, where we worked with UNHCR and UN agencies. But it was very important for us to tell them exactly where we want the money to go. So the majority of that response plan, which was done during my time in office, I've read it, I know it, I've worked on it. The majority of the resources went to direct cash transfers to refugee families and receiving families. And also we have health services, because we have a national system of health payments. So we have a national insurance system in the health sector. So, we started with reproductive health. So a lot of babies were born in Moldova immediately following the beginning of the war. And for example, UNFPO, the Population Fund, UNFP, would direct the resources based on sort of our receipts. So actually, there are monitoring mechanisms. So either the money that in the response plan is given directly to the beneficiaries, or there are systems that are completely auditable. So we also created a treasury account, which has a separate reporting requirement. And this was actually done based on the model that we used in the pandemic. So actually some of these sort of mechanisms that you create in a time of crisis, if you create them well, then they serve you later on as well. So for example, our Ministry of Finance was able to very quickly put up this treasury account with sort of very clear reporting guidelines and with reports that our donors trust.
Any more questions?
Nope.
First of all, thank you very much. This was really enlightening for me. I'm not a specialist on Moldova, but I congratulate you and your country as well on having reached the candidate status, and that the Commission has now recommended opening negotiations. I mean, that is not, of course, it's extreme circumstances, but it also is a testimony to what the country has been doing in terms of preparation, in terms of meeting the preconditions on the rule of law, on anti-oligarch laws, etc., etc. This is really an impressive achievement under extremely difficult circumstances, which makes it all the more impressive. Just a question for you. I mean, where do you see, how quickly do you see this developing now for you in the coming year, in the coming years? I mean, of course, it's impossible to foretell because anything could happen. But assuming that you keep up this kind of speed, where do you think how fast this might go? Thank you.
So just for those of you who are less familiar with Moldova, in 2020, we had presidential elections which brought President Maya Sandu, a woman, the first woman president to power. And then in July 2021, in parliamentary elections, there was a large majority for a pro-European party that came to power on a platform of combating corruption, reforming the judiciary, and improving governance in all fields. So in a sense, the type of response that we had was not an accident. It was actually sort of the moment when the people of Moldova said, actually, we are ready to make a very clear choice on our direction of development. So we already, had in our program and in our DNA this very strong governance impetus. So when we applied to be members or to candidate status to the European Union, we actually already had started very, very important reforms, especially in terms of justice reform. These are very difficult. They meet with a lot of resistance, and there's a lot of internal turmoil. So while you have all these crises, there's also sort of internal tug and pull between different forces, because these entrenched interests don't want to be reformed or don't want to be weakened. But we worked very much on it. I think now we are in another, and just before I move on, I just want to tell you that, I don't think it's a coincidence that Moldova did so well in managing all these crises while we had a woman president, a woman prime minister, a woman minister of interior, a woman minister of interior, a woman at the head of the constitutional court, and a woman who is the anti-corruption prosecutor. So this is just a little plug on women's leadership, which was discussed in the previous session. But what is happening now, in October we have presidential elections and we have a constitutional referendum on joining the EU. And what we're seeing is actually, since the war in Ukraine, there is no military activity in Moldova, but there is a hybrid war with Russia. So there is a lot of disinformation, a lot of cyber attacks, a lot of bomb threats, covert activities. So we are in a hybrid war with Russia. If you watch the declarations, they are very inflammatory. And then every now and then, it's like we are tested through actions of the Transnistrian region. How strong or weak we are in terms of this resilience to hybrid war elements. So what we're seeing now is actually there is sort of course, when a new government comes, they come on very high expectations. So we see this sort of, disappointment that justice reform is not going so quickly, that the economic situation has not improved. And, people don't want to hear that it's because of the war. They want to hear, when are they going to live better? And at the same time, we have this sort of inflow of money that is corrupting our political system, and sort of this Russian interference in our political system. So I think we're going to go through this difficult turmoil in terms of our electoral cycle. But should we be able to maintain the pro-European course, then I think Moldova's prospects are excellent. Because I don't think anybody expected Moldova to diversify 100% of its energy dependency on Russia in 1 year. 1 year. We were the very first country to use the Trans-Balkan pipeline in reverse. We were the very first country to use the Greece-Bulgaria interconnector which was not designed for us. It was designed for, the gas flow to the Western Europe. So we punched above our weight, and I think we are capable of doing that even further on. And we are a small country. We have a very large and active diaspora in the European Union. So a lot of Moldovans have actually double citizenship with Romania and are able to travel and work in the European Union. And they have accumulated over the years a lot of know-how that actually helps us build capacities. So for example, throughout all these crises, we had to do this extended questionnaire for the European Commission. And of course, the European Commission takes these bureaucratic elements very, very seriously. And we actually did that with public servants, but also with diaspora, people in the diaspora who helped us translate all of this to Bruxelloise, to the sort of Brussels language, right? So we had these elements where we used innovative mechanisms to expand quickly our capacity where this was needed. Of course, this has to come with leadership and management, but it also has to sort of be supported by the society and the diaspora. So I think if we are capable of being resilient and resisting to this Russian interfering, with the help of our partners, hopefully, then we can move ahead very quickly.
Well, I just received news. We have a little opportunity for a few more questions. President Constantinescu is on his way. Probably in about 10 minutes will arrive. So I thought it's better. Let's extend the session a little bit, use the chance to benefit from your wisdom, stay in the room, and then we're ready once he arrives. So, so it's a chance for you to continue. Willem, if you want.
Just one.
I see two questions there. So.
Greg, are you here with the other mic? If you could just raise your hand so you can see if you have a question.
You can go. You wanted us. And then you can do it then.
Oh, I see. Thank you very much, Madam Prime Minister, for a very convincing case on how culture a cohesive culture, can fight back hard power. I've done a bit of research. I see that probably on military rankings, you are something like 144 out of 145 on some indices. So obviously there's no hard power there, and we are just using soft skills to fight back any aggression or anything that seeks to corrupt your identity. Is there any deliberate nation branding project in Moldova that drives this agenda to use soft skills to fight back the Russian incursion?
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. Indeed, Moldova has no hard power. It has been neutral since its declaration of the independence, and neutrality was enshrined in the constitution as a defense against sort of the stationing of Russian troops. So, for example, in the international fora, we kept using this argument to ask kindly the Russian troops to leave the territory of Moldova, and even Russia took some commitments at the OSCE Istanbul Forum in 1999 to withdraw the troops, but it never did. But we're seeing that this neutrality actually is not serving us very well. And in fact, if you look at neutral countries, they have to have strong military to be able to defend themselves. So like if you look at Switzerland. So we are actually now increasing our capacity for defense. I wouldn't say hard power, but mostly improved communications, improved sort of response to emergencies and to like medical services in the military and so on. So building more of that, but also we're looking, for resources to defend our skies, for example, from missiles. But indeed, you know, if you ask Moldovans, they don't want to be part of any military alliance, and they really sort of, if you ask anybody, they say, oh, just do whatever, we want to ensure peace. So yes, we have to be better at our soft power, and over the years we've had multiple projects to brand the country, or to produce sort of a branding of the country, and this was done by our Invest in Moldova agency, only, I think, about 10 years ago, there was a sort of a more inspired idea where many designers, there was an inclusive process to get designers to work on a branding, and there is the Moldovan Tree of Life, as we call it, and there's a brand, and it actually took a couple of years, but it is now really catching on and is very popular both with Moldovans and tourists who come. So it's, you know, we have like souvenirs and so on, and so and we have branded elements that we give as protocol gifts and so on. We never had one of these international advertisement on CNN or BBC, or like you see Azerbaijan, for example, do. But we do promote sort of this country brand sort of within our operations. But what I will tell you is that we have something that works for the branding of the country that the government has nothing to do with, and this is our wine. So I told you about the embargoes that were introduced on our wines. Well, our wine industry went through a very difficult time during 2 embargoes, in 2006 and then in 2013. And basically, the wine industry had to look upon itself and say, either we improve quality and marketing and access Western and international markets, or we die, you know, because Russia would no longer take our wines. So what happened is that we saw this profound transformation in our wine industry, and we now have a very sort of strong and important wine industry. Last year we took over 300 medals in the international competitions, and in a double-blind tasting competition in Brussels, a Moldovan red wine was declared the best red wine in the world. And we now export to a lot of countries and are more and more known, actually, because of our quality, good product. So in a sense, if we talk about country branding, it's sort of what the government can do, but sometimes governments are not great at, you know, producing some of the, so you really have to employ, you know, good quality creative industries. So we have a strong creative industry now, also because of the wines, because they had to think about their marketing, and they had to think about sort of ways in which they can create an identity, a niche for Moldovan wines. So this is also why now we have better cinematographers, for example, because they had to shoot attractive, good quality, international level advertisements for the Moldovan wines. So this is a process that is very much interlinked, and it's a whole of society effort. So I would argue that both sort of cultural diplomacy and sort of country promotion actually is not only done by government, but it's a sort of an effort that if you manage to do it as inclusively as possible, then you stand a much better chance of it being a good quality process.
Well, on that note, let's express our sincere gratitude to the Honorable Natalia Gavrilita.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation.